Christmas time is full of traditions. I don't know of any family that does not have traditions of some sort. Even if your tradition is to have no tradition, it's still a tradition. We all have traditions in some way. Some of them start at Christmas Eve, and sometimes they can go through the morning, Boxing Day traditions and in Australia and so on. And when a couple marry, there are often clashes of expectations around these very traditions. And certainly as someone who's spent a long time in marriage and family therapy, births, christenings, marriages, Christmases and deaths are 5 peak family events which will bring the family's system or the family's network and family's expectation to the surface for good and or for ill. And this is always true of different people. Who will we have for Christmas? Who will come? What will we do? Who will not come? Sometimes they organically change over time. They can include travel. They can include people packing up early in the morning and going to fun family. I can recall back in the earlier days when our family were young and I was a minister at Hornsby Heights. We would do church. One we rode from church out to Penrith, Emu Plains for lunch, and then from Emu Plains to Carringbar for dinner, and then we came home. Happy Christmas. I think that was the moment we decided that, no, it was after our daughter got chicken pox just before Christmas, and no one wanted to see us. And so our kids we were sitting out having bought a chook late in the day and had a Christmas dinner together. And our children said, "Why can't we do this every year? This has been so good," which began the change of a tradition in my earlier family. This year, with Annie and I, we've had adult children now. Children with families have been with their other families, but we had adult children. And it was interesting to bring them together and things that they expected from Christmas Eve all the way through to last night, Boxing Day. Of Christmas morning, things that just get up and have cereal and toast as far as I was concerned, but no. You have ham and croissants and cheese and that, which was very important for Annie's daughter. But then, of course, there was a long-held Boxing Day tradition in our family, which any person coming into the family must at least comply with on one occasion. We have our Boxing Day breakfast, which is sacred, and that is a full English breakfast. Nothing different about that, you say? Well, bacon and ham and eggs and tomatoes and mushrooms. But 2 special ingredients that go onto that. One is black pudding, and the other, and the other is fried Christmas pudding. Oh, you put it in, it's cholesterol free. You put it in the frying pan after the bacon's all been cooked, and it crystallises the fruit, and it has a beautiful taste. Now, anybody who comes in the family has to have that at least once, otherwise they're always suspect about being part of the family. And it's interesting how it actually grows on people. But that's just one of the traditions, and that comes from my Irish grandmother, who lived with me as a child, and that was part of the tradition that she brought into the family, and that not all of us, my sisters, reneged, but my brother and I, we continued that particular story, that particular tradition. But we all have them, and they're special. For some, attending church is part of it on Christmas morning. For others, and that might be the only time apart from Easter, when some people come with families who go to church. Christmas has become that family time for so many people. And we do travel. We travel. And to get together, it's not about the travelling off, it's about being together with family and with the extended family that is there. This particular passage that we have in Luke's Gospel is interesting, because it's interesting from a number of points, but just some brief ones, it only occurs in Luke. It's unique to the Lucan passage and probably comes out of his own particular material. It's the only story about Jesus as a child, in his sort of that late around that 12-year-old period. It is used by Luke to indicate the family practice and heritage. The idea of "as was their usual custom" is repeated over and again. It also indicates a transition of Jesus' own awareness of himself in the context of his family. It is a passage that Luke uses to construct his message of Jesus moving in a transition from childhood. The next is the opening after this story is into his ministry. It's a transitional story in a variety of ways, and it's quite fascinating. A story of Jesus' family and life is not one which has been put together. This is a story of Jesus, but to glean the story of Jesus, who he was, you've got to go into various parts of the Gospels to get a phrase here or a verse there or something else that is there. We know that Jesus was born of Mary and Joseph, and in John 8, the illegitimacy of that birth is made reference to. Born travelling to Bethlehem in the census, cousin to John the Baptist, Elizabeth, being the aunt that Jesus spends time with. They flee to Egypt to escape persecution. They become refugees. He has brothers and sisters. There are those in some parts of the gospel story which believe and those who don't, and there is contrasting between those who are of the faith of the family of Jesus and those who constitute true family of Jesus. Jesus comes of age at Yom Kippur. James, his brother, is one of those who becomes a respected leader of the church, of the early Christian church. They're just a very quick glimpse of some of these stories. But when you look into the story of Jesus, you'd ask the question, what was their family customs? And very clearly in this particular passage, which talks about Joseph and Mary being devout Jewish family. They go to Nazareth, to Bethlehem, and they bring Jesus with him. Joseph and Mary took him to be presented to the Lord in the earlier passage in Luke chapter 2, in the earlier passage, to be presented to Simeon. And the combination of Joseph and Mary are used over and over again. Joseph and Mary take Jesus. And Simeon blesses and says, God's blessing, God's wisdom will be upon him, God's grace is with him. And the verses those verses bookend that the grace of, and the child grew and became strong. He was filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was upon him. There was a sense in which Simeon says God's grace is with him as this young child after the 8th day. James McClendon is a writer of theology in biography and narratives, and he says that if we look closely into all of our lives, there is a central metaphor that actually can help to explain who we are. Likewise, there's a central metaphor that goes into every family to give some meaning and understanding of the family. And that's a difficult thing sometimes to grasp, but it's worth reflecting when I've done work with families over and over again over many, many years and ask the question, what is the metaphor or what is the image would characterise you as a person? What is the animal or the bird or a statement that characterises you? And if people start to think about it, how does that then reflect how they have lived? How has it shaped their life? I wonder what metaphor or image we would give to Jesus' early life. And for that matter, about your own life. What image, what metaphor, what word might you have? Some families have their crests, their shields, their mottos. Schools have them. Sometimes they become constricting, other times they become life-giving. it's interesting to reflect upon the metaphors, the images, that in our own ways, they're the myths that we carry, that you have. For some families, as I said, they can be life-giving in terms of you will succeed, that you will be a success. You're the golden-haired boy, you're the one who's, you're always the one who comes second. And there are people who talk to me about class and that sort of thing in Sydney. I say, well, it does exist, and they say it doesn't exist, and we'll have a bit of a discussion around that. Because, if people who live in the western suburbs, in the Housing Commission suburbs of Sydney, if you get to 15 or get to 16 and do your school certificate, you've been the most educated person in the family. Whereas most of us come from families where the expectation is you'll go on to year 12 and then go on to university or go on to some other study. It is just a given. It's not even a question that people have. And so there are statements, there are beliefs, there are images that we have. And some people know and live out, I am always second class. I'm always inferior. What else might you expect? Then there are other images, a bit like the ugly duckling. Start out as a duck and become a swan. So there are different metaphors that people can have, and they're transformative metaphors that various families have. And it's worth thinking about that. If we'd had children here today, I was going to ask them, what are the things that your family do every time you have Christmas? Whenever you go to grandma's or wherever you go to somebody else's, what actually happens? There are certain rituals that take place that shape a person's life. Now, in our day and age, we'd almost want to report Joseph and Mary to the Department of Community Services for leaving Jesus in Jerusalem because they didn't know he wasn't coming with them. And they go for a day's journey. But what it also is that in this particular story, it talks about the way in which family and community and relatives cohese around each other. And there was an expectation that Jesus would be with them. That was normal. And in a situation where travelling from Jerusalem back to Nazareth was not a safe journey, there was safety in the context of being with others. I mean, I grew up in times we went and played down in Bexley Bush, which then became Bartle Park Golf Course, which we weren't too pleased about. But it was okay to go and play there, and we just told our parents we're going down the bush, and they would know where that was, and we'd come home about 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, when it was dark, and have tea, and that was okay. But these days you wouldn't do that. You don't do that so easily anyway. There's a sense in which the community, our community, has changed and become more fractured. How do we develop a sense of community and trust within relatives, within families and friends, particularly when we know that the majority of sexual abuse takes place within the family dynamic and domestic violence as well? Places of trust and safety are so important to develop. But they discover that Jesus is not with them. And so they go back, they start searching for him. And the word search and look and seek is the word actually in the Greek. And we have two competing images in verses 47 and 48, where you've got the story here which says that Jesus is with the elders and they're having a discussion. And they are astonished at his answers. And the word astonished actually means it changes their own mind of their thinking of understanding. And then you have the other thing, which is the depth of his answers show a deep wisdom and insight. And Luke has this nice theological thing about the word seek that's in there and the 3 days, which he then creates throughout Luke. And so you have this picture that we have very briefly sketched for us about Jesus in the temple having this discussion. Mary and Joseph by this time have been searching for 3 days, seeking Jesus, seeking him out. Where is he? And so you have this nice statement in the scriptures, which is, I think the scriptures are nicely sanitised in terms of the meaning that's underneath what's actually said. The scriptures say, they were astonished and say, "Son, what have you done?" I think they're saying, "Where the bloody hell have you been?" That's what I think is it. Don't you realise the anxiety you've caused us? Now, that's an Australian version of it, but that's the intent of that statement. It wasn't just, "Oh, dear me, you've been here all the 3 times. Very nice place to be here, to be in the church for 3 days." That's not their experience, because they come as parents. And we've all had that situation where we've had kids go astray and we've gone looking for them. And they go and they search for Jesus. And there is this interesting verse that Jesus then responds, and it's impossible to translate. And usually you use the word house, don't you know, "I must be in my Father's house." The literal translation is, "In the gap of my Father, it is necessary I must be." The word house is not in the text. "In thee of my Father, it is necessary I must be." And we've used that over and over again as a way of getting people to come to church. Doesn't mention it. The word house or temple is not mentioned. And so other translations, another way have wrestled with that. And a better translation is, "I must be about my Father's business or affairs. I must be in the service. I must be engaged in what is my Father's business." And there was this interesting transition of Jesus as a child into a different place. A differentiating process which all families, all children must do. And that is, he separates himself out from his parents. And he actually says, "I'm about something different." That's the first indication of Jesus having something of a relationship with God, which marks him out. It's his first statements that Jesus makes about himself in the scriptures. And in this way, he is separating himself out from his family and from others, and says, "I must be about my Father's business." And in this context, the word Father would only be used because of the times in which it was written. It's become a patriarchal thing, and Father has become a block which people have used for God. But in this context, it has to be used of the general sense of who God is. The identity that he has there. He then starts to say, "I must be about something different." And the word "seek" is used here in this particular section where Joseph and Mary seek Jesus. They seek Jesus, they look and search. Later on in Luke's Gospel, the multitudes seek Jesus. Later on it talks about those who seek will find. And so there's this growing sense of seek ye first as well the kingdom or the reign or the community of God. The idea of seeking begins here that Luke uses, and it becomes a transition that he has in this transitional story, not only about Jesus, but about what Jesus' purpose and ministry was to be about. It was to be separate from and connected to the world in which he was to live, and yet bring about something which was radically different. And the end of it, it says that Jesus grew. Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and with favour with God and all the community. It's bookended. This little section is bookended by, firstly, God's favour being on him, and then the community recognising the wisdom of God within him. And then it goes on into the gospel. It's a fascinating chapter, little story. And we could do more with it by just sort of digging into it. But it really is about inviting us, people in the temple, in the church. What is our story? our personal story, how has our lives been both part of our families and separate to them? What has our faith journey been like? And I think about this church. Churches have metaphors and stories. The church's history has a metaphor. And if you read the book Pride and Faith, what might be a metaphor that's undergirded the church here? But also, metaphors can become constricting and life-draining, or metaphors can be creative and life-giving. Metaphors that are useful need to be able to grow and open and lead us out into something different. And it seems to me that we're at the point of transition, like Jesus was, and he invites us to move forward into this new year. What might be the metaphors that we have used? How are we transitioning into the future? And what might be some metaphors or images that are useful for us in giving us some direction? As we approach the new year, our metaphors, our decisions aren't just flippant, but they ought to be something of purposeful intent that gives life to us and life to the community that we serve. Amen.